Unrest in the Ukraine. Background. Together, we will read the information below on the ongoing protests in the Ukraine, and then you will fill out the boxes on the handout charting the crisis. Be prepared to share your answers. What triggered the political crisis? In November of 2013, widespread protests broke out in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. These protests responded to President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to back out of a plan to sign a far reaching agreement with the European Union. The plan would have established a closer political and economic relationship with the EU and signaled Ukraine's interest in joining the 28 nation bloc. Pro EU Ukrainians took to the streets hoping that Yanukovych would retract his decision. He did not, and instead signed a $15 billion trade deal with Russia. Pro EU demonstrators rejected Yanukovych's decision to deepen Ukraine's ties with Russia and continued their demonstrations. Moscow had controlled the territory of present day Ukraine for centuries, up until 1991. And many protesters did not want to see hard won gains, specifically those tied to political and economic independence, undone. How did Yanukovych government respond to the pro EU protests? Starting in November of 2013, riot police and security forces used violence and intimidation tactics in their crackdowns against demonstrators. In January 2014, Yanukovych's government implemented anti-democratic legislation restricting political dissent. The legislation banned the installation of tents and stages in political spaces, criminalized the use of masks and helmets at protest, and outlawed the slandering of government officials. Facing immense public pressure and criticism from the international community, the government repealed the laws just 2 weeks after they had been enacted. Anti Yanukovych demonstrations and fears about Russia's sway over the Ukraine continued. In late February, the violence reached an all time high, with rising death tolls among protesters and the police. Under growing pressure, Yanukovych fled Kiev, and the parliament voted to oust him from government. After this turn of events, the chiefs of the riot, police, and security forces signaled their interest in withdrawing from all conflict. Who are the anti Yanukovych protesters? The pro EU protests quickly came to be called Euromaidan movement. The name Euromaidan merges Euro with Maidan, Ukrainian for square. Ukrainians often use Maidan to refer to Independence Square in Kiev, where hundreds of thousands of protesters have rallied over past months. Euromaidan protesters are mainly from Kiev and Western Ukraine and include, among others, students, workers, retirees, entrepreneurs, and journalists. These protesters extreme demands extend far beyond establishing a stronger partnership with the EU and center around human rights, freedom, and democracy. Other groups, such as right wing nationalists, have carried out their own anti Yanukovych demonstrations. Who are the pro Yanukovych demonstrators? Ukrainians are not united in their demands for future of their country. Widespread divisions hinge upon the question, should Ukraine follow a European path or establish closer ties with Russia? Tens of thousands of Ukrainians have participated in rallies that not only signal their support for Yanukovych, but also a preference for continued strong ties with Russia. Many pro Yanukovych demonstrators are from the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. regions that are the base of Yanukovych's support. The location of the major industries and where Russians is more commonly spoken, most pro Yanukovych protesters reject the idea of a far reaching partnership with the EU, fearing that such an agreement would do more harm than good to the Ukrainian economy and their livelihoods. What are some of the international perspectives of the situation? In the European Union, Yanukovych's decision to break off the agreement with the EU left many European leaders perplexed. Why did Yanukovych back out of a deal that was 5 years in the making? EU members have identified Russia as a contributing factor. Many have criticized Russia for exerting economic and political pressure on its neighbor, Ukraine, and for meddling in Ukraine's efforts to form ties with the EU. Appalled by the violation of human rights and the deaths of dozens of Ukrainian civilians, the EU imposed sanctions against Ukraine, who are responsible for the violence. In Russia, officially, Russia claims to have a policy of non intervention in Ukraine politics. However, Russia is interested in keeping Ukraine within its sphere of influence. Russia's natural gas pipelines travel across Ukraine, and Ukraine itself is a major market for Russian gas. Politically, Russia does not want Ukraine to form stronger ties with the EU. Russia has labeled pro EU Ukrainian demonstrators as extremists and condemned these protesters for attempting to initiate a coup. In the United States, the Obama administration is closely monitoring the ongoing crisis. The U.S. State Department has condemned the Ukrainian government's use of violence following the first deaths of the protesters. The U.S. State Department announced visa sanctions against Ukrainian officials. The crisis has heightened tension between the United States and Russia. U.S. officials continue to side with the EU on the issue. Now you will look at charting the crisis and the questions that are asked.